Do you remember Christmas desserts when your grandmother's kitchen smelled like butter and sugar for 3 straight days? The counter is covered with cooling racks, holding desserts you'd never see in any bakery, each requiring techniques learned by watching hands, never from recipes.
Christmas during the Depression meant making do. This bread pudding, simple as it looks, was a real treat for us back then.
In 1960, 30 desserts appeared at every Christmas. By 1975, half vanished. Today, families bake 3. These weren't sweets. They were proof that Christmas required sacrifice, not shortcuts. Number 23, demanding gelatin timing so precise most failed, shows what mastery meant. Tonight, we document all 30 before the last grandmothers who remember die. Walk into any 1960s kitchen on December 20th, and you'd find grandmothers making divinity, the temperamental white candy that required perfect weather conditions and arm strength that separated skilled candy makers from hopeful amateurs. This cloud-like confection cost about 50 cents for ingredients and produced 40 pieces of candy that dissolved on your tongue like sweet snow. Grandmothers made divinity by boiling sugar syrup to exactly 260 degrees, then beating it into stiff egg whites until the mixture held peaks and could be dropped onto waxed paper. The beating took 15 minutes of constant motion, creating arm fatigue that announced you'd earned your Christmas candy through genuine labor. The weather had to cooperate. Humid days prevented divinity from setting properly, creating sticky failure instead of firm candy. Grandmothers checked weather forecasts before attempting divinity, understanding that some desserts required environmental cooperation, not just skill. Boiled raisin cake transformed humble ingredients into dark, moist Christmas cake that lasted for weeks without refrigeration. This Depression-era holdover cost about 75 cents and produced a 2-layer cake that improved with age as flavors melded and intensified. Grandmothers made boiled raisin cake by simmering raisins with water, sugar, and spices until the mixture reduced to thick syrup, then stirring in flour and eggs to create batter. The boiling process plumped the raisins and infused the liquid with concentrated fruit flavor that permeated every bite. The cake required no frosting. The dark, spiced cake was substantial enough to stand alone, and the slight stickiness of the surface announced proper moisture content. Grandmothers wrapped cooled cakes in waxed paper and stored them in tins, knowing they'd be even better on Christmas Day than when first baked. 7-layer cookies announced ambition and patience through their rainbow stripes of almond-flavored layers separated by apricot jam. This labor-intensive creation cost about $1 and produced 4 dozen cookies that looked like they belonged in a bakery window rather than a home kitchen. Grandmothers made 7-layer cookies by baking 7 thin cake layers in jelly roll pans, spreading each with apricot jam, then stacking them into a towering construction that was weighted overnight to compress the layers. The next day, the stack was cut into small rectangles and dipped in chocolate, creating cookies that revealed their rainbow interior when bitten. The process took 2 days and required precision. Uneven layers created lopsided stacks. Insufficient jam made the layers separate, and improper weighting left gaps between layers. Only experienced bakers attempted 7-layer cookies because failure meant wasting expensive ingredients and 2 days of work. Ribbon gelatin salad brought modernist design to Christmas dessert tables through its striped layers of jewel-toned gelatin. This mid-century creation cost about 60 cents and produced a molded dessert that wobbled elegantly on cut glass serving plates, announcing that your grandmother embraced contemporary food trends. Grandmothers made ribbon gelatin by preparing multiple flavors of Jell-O, usually red, green, and white, and layering them in molds with careful timing, so each layer set before the next was added. The process took 6 hours because rushing created blurred layers instead of crisp stripes. The unmolding required courage. The entire dessert could collapse if the mold wasn't properly loosened. Grandmothers dipped molds briefly in warm water, then inverted them onto plates with prayers that the gelatin would release intact and maintain its shape through dinner service. Fruitcake represented the ultimate make-ahead dessert, baked in November and soaked weekly with whiskey until Christmas, transformed it from dry brick into moist, boozy confection. This patience-requiring creation cost about $2 and produced a 3-pound cake that lasted through New Year's if anyone actually ate it. Grandmothers made fruitcake by mixing candied fruits, nuts, and just enough batter to hold everything together, then baking the dense mixture for hours at low temperature. The real work came after baking. Every week the cake was unwrapped, poked with a skewer, and doused with whiskey that soaked into the dense crumb. The whiskey preservation meant fruitcake was one of the few Christmas desserts that could be made weeks in advance, teaching grandmothers planning skills and understanding that some traditions required starting preparation before Thanksgiving. Rehook 5 desserts down, and you're witnessing 1960s ambition, divinity requiring perfect weather, boiled raisin cake improving with age, 7-layer cookies taking 2 days, ribbon gelatin needing 6 hours of timing, fruitcake soaked weekly for months. Grandmothers were chemists, understanding that time and precision created Christmas magic. 25 more desserts reveal the complete tradition. Peppermint chiffon pie brought lightness to heavy Christmas meals through its cloud-like filling that tasted like crushed candy canes transformed into elegant dessert. This festive creation cost about 85 cents and produced an 8-inch pie that looked impressive despite requiring only basic ingredients and one specialized technique. Grandmothers made peppermint chiffon pie by dissolving gelatin in hot milk, stirring in crushed peppermint candy until it melted completely, then folding the mixture into whipped cream and egg whites beaten to stiff peaks. The folding technique separated experienced bakers from novices. Too vigorous and the air deflated, too gentle and streaks of gelatin remained visible. The pie required several hours of refrigeration to set properly, with grandmothers checking periodically to ensure the filling was firm enough to slice cleanly. The candy cane garnish on top announced the flavor before anyone tasted, creating visual connection between the dessert and Christmas candy traditions. The chiffon texture, lighter than pudding, more substantial than mousse, represented 1960s fascination with airy desserts that seemed sophisticated and modern. The technique of folding whipped cream into gelatin base appeared in dozens of recipes during this era, creating a whole category of chiffon desserts that have largely disappeared from modern baking. Demanded patience and arm strength to roll the sticky mixture into perfect logs that sliced into pinwheel cookies. This no-bake creation cost about 90 cents and produced 3 rolls that yielded 75 cookies, perfect for cookie exchange parties. Grandmothers made date nut roll by cooking dates with sugar and water until they formed thick paste, then stirring in chopped walnuts and vanilla. The hot mixture was spread onto damp kitchen towels, then rolled tightly while still warm, creating spiral logs that were refrigerated overnight until firm enough to slice. The rolling technique required working quickly before the mixture cooled and became too stiff to roll, but not so quickly that the towel stuck to the filling. Grandmothers developed instinct for the perfect moment to roll, understanding that timing mattered as much as ingredients. The sliced cookies revealed beautiful spirals of dark date filling wrapped around lighter nut-studded exterior, creating visual appeal that announced careful technique. The cookies improved after a few days as flavors melded, making them ideal for advanced preparation during the hectic Christmas season. Mincemeat tarts brought medieval tradition to 1960s Christmas tables through their spiced filling that contained no actual meat, despite the name. This historical dessert cost about $1 and produced 24 tarts that connected families to centuries of Christmas baking tradition. Grandmothers made mincemeat tarts using jarred mincemeat, a mixture of dried fruits, spices, suet, and sometimes brandy, spooned into pastry shells and baked until the filling bubbled and the crust turned golden. The challenge was preventing the filling from boiling over and creating burnt spots on the pan. The tarts were served warm with hard sauce, butter, and powdered sugar, beaten until fluffy, flavored with vanilla or brandy. The hard sauce melted on contact with the warm tart, creating a rich sauce that balanced the intense spice of the mincemeat. Many grandmothers made their own mincemeat in the fall, cooking down apples, raisins, and spices with suet and brandy, then canning the mixture for Christmas baking. This advanced preparation demonstrated the kind of seasonal planning that characterized serious baking, with fall preserving enabling winter celebration. Bonbons transformed sweetened coconut into truffle-like candies dipped in chocolate, creating elegant confections that looked professional despite simple preparation. This candy-making project cost about 70 cents and produced 60 bonbons that filled decorative tins given as Christmas gifts. Grandmothers made coconut bonbons by mixing sweetened condensed milk with shredded coconut and powdered sugar until the mixture held together, then rolling it into small balls and refrigerating them until firm. The chilled balls were dipped in melted chocolate, creating a thin shell that cracked when bitten to reveal the sweet coconut center. The chocolate dipping required technique. The chocolate had to be the right temperature so it coated smoothly without being too thick or too thin. Grandmothers tested the chocolate on one bonbon before committing to dipping the entire batch, understanding that chocolate that was too hot made the coconut balls fall apart, while chocolate that was too cool created thick, lumpy coating. The bonbons were arranged in decorative tins with waxed paper between layers, creating gifts that announced the giver had invested time and skill rather than just money. Pfeffernusse cookies brought German tradition to American Christmas through their spiced, pepper-tinged cookies that softened over time as they absorbed moisture from the air. This ethnic heritage dessert cost about 60 cents and produced 100 small cookies that improved with age and connected families to their immigrant ancestors. Grandmothers made pfeffernusse by mixing flour with an elaborate spice blend, including black pepper, anise, cardamom, cinnamon, and cloves, then adding molasses and honey to create stiff dough. The dough was rolled into small balls and baked until firm, then rolled in powdered sugar while still warm. The cookies were rock-hard when fresh but transformed over 2 weeks into tender, cake-like treats as they absorbed humidity. This aging process meant pfeffernusse had to be made well before Christmas, requiring the kind of advance planning that separated organized bakers from last-minute ones. German-American families particularly treasured pfeffernusse because the cookies connected them to homeland traditions and demonstrated that their ethnic heritage deserved preservation even as they assimilated into American culture. The distinctive spice blend announced German identity through flavor. Rehhock 10 desserts down, and you're seeing technique mastery. Chiffon pies requiring perfect folding, date rolls demanding precise timing, mincemeat connecting to medieval tradition, bonbons needing chocolate temperature control. pfeffernuss aging for 2 weeks. Grandmothers were artisans, understanding that technique and patience created Christmas excellence. 20 more desserts complete the tradition. Lady Baltimore cake represented Southern elegance transplanted nationwide through church cookbooks and women's magazines. This elaborate layer cake cost about $1.50 and produced a 3-layer masterpiece that announced serious baking skills through its fruit and nut-studded filling and fluffy white frosting. Grandmothers made Lady Baltimore cake by baking 3 white cake layers, then preparing a filling of chopped raisins, figs, pecans, and sometimes cherries mixed into boiled frosting. The filling had to be spread while still spreadable, but not so warm it melted the cake layers, requiring timing that came from experience. The exterior frosting was 7-minute frosting, egg whites and sugar beaten over simmering water until the mixture formed stiff, glossy peaks. The beating took exactly 7 minutes. No more and no less, teaching grandchildren that some recipes required precise timing rather than judgment calls. The assembled cake stood tall and impressive, with the dark, fruit-studded filling visible between snowy white layers. Slicing revealed the contrast between pure white cake and jewel-toned filling, creating visual drama that made the cake worthy of the most important Christmas dinner. The cake's name sparked debates. Some claimed it honored a Baltimore socialite, others insisted it came from a novel character. These origin story discussions revealed that recipes carried histories and that knowing the story mattered as much as knowing the technique. Lady Baltimore cake appeared primarily at formal Christmas dinners where presentation mattered as much as taste, where the dessert needed to impress guests and demonstrate the hostess's skill. The labor-intensive preparation meant the cake announced that this meal warranted special effort. Cherry Winks brought whimsy to Christmas cookie plates through their crushed cornflake coating and maraschino cherry wink on top. This playful cookie cost about 70 cents for a batch of 4 dozen and demonstrated how 1960s bakers embraced convenience ingredients like cornflakes and maraschino cherries. Grandmothers made cherry winks by mixing standard cookie dough with chopped dates and pecans, forming the dough into balls, rolling them in crushed cornflakes, then topping each with a maraschino cherry quarter before baking. The cornflake coating created crunchy exterior that contrasted with the soft, chewy interior. The cookies required gentle handling because the cornflake coating could fall off if the cookies were moved too roughly. Grandmothers learned to transfer them carefully from baking sheet to cooling rack, understanding that the coating was fragile until the cookies cooled completely. The maraschino cherry on top provided the wink, a bright red dot that made the cookies instantly recognizable on crowded cookie exchange tables. The cherry also served as flavor marker, announcing that these cookies contained fruit and weren't just plain sugar cookies with fancy coating. Cherry Winks represented 1960s willingness to embrace processed ingredients like cornflakes and maraschino cherries that previous generations would have considered inappropriate for serious baking. This acceptance of convenience foods marked a shift in baking culture, with grandmothers adapting traditional techniques to incorporate modern ingredients. The cookies' playful name and appearance made them popular with children who loved the crunchy coating and sweet cherry. This child appeal meant Cherry Winks often appeared at family gatherings rather than formal events, marking them as fun rather than fancy. Brandied hard sauce wasn't technically a dessert, but an essential accompaniment that transformed plain cakes and puddings into elegant Christmas fare. This boozy butter creation cost about 40 cents and produced a cup of sauce that elevated simple desserts into special occasion-worthy treats. Grandmothers made hard sauce by beating softened butter with powdered sugar until fluffy and white, then adding brandy and vanilla. The beating took 10 minutes by hand, creating arm fatigue that electric mixers would later eliminate, but that 1960s grandmothers accepted as the price of proper sauce. The sauce was formed into a log, wrapped in waxed paper, and refrigerated until firm. When served, slices were cut from the log and placed on hot desserts, where they slowly melted, creating a rich, brandy-flavored sauce that soaked into cake or pudding. Hard sauce appeared with plum pudding, gingerbread, mincemeat pie, and fruit cake, any dessert that benefited from added richness and moisture. The brandy content made it adults-only accompaniment, with children receiving plain whipped cream instead. The sauce represented Victorian tradition maintained into the 1960s, connecting modern grandmothers to their own grandmothers who'd made the same sauce for the same desserts. This continuity of tradition mattered as much as the sauce itself, creating links across generations through shared recipes. Some grandmothers made rum hard sauce instead of brandy, creating regional and family variations that marked each household's version as distinctive. These variations meant that experienced eaters could identify which grandmother had made which sauce, creating culinary signatures that announced identity through flavor. Also called Mexican wedding cookies or snowball cookies, brought buttery, nut-studded elegance to cookie plates through their distinctive twice-rolled-in powdered sugar coating. This melt-in-your-mouth cookie cost about 60 cents per batch and produced 5 dozen cookies that looked like snow-covered truffles. Grandmothers made Russian tea cakes by creaming butter with powdered sugar, then mixing in finely chopped pecans or walnuts and flour to create tender dough. The dough was shaped into small balls and baked until barely golden, then rolled in powdered sugar while still hot, cooled, and rolled in sugar again. The double sugar coating created the cookie's signature appearance, thick white covering that left powdered sugar on fingers and lips when eaten. The first rolling, done while cookies were hot, created a base layer that absorbed into the cookie surface. The second rolling, after cooling, created the thick exterior coating. The cookies required very finely chopped nuts. Large pieces created cookies that crumbled when bitten. Grandmothers either chopped nuts by hand with sharp knives or ran them through hand-cranked nut grinders, creating the fine texture that allowed the cookies to hold together despite their tender, crumbly nature. Russian tea cakes appeared at every cookie exchange and on every Christmas cookie plate, their white coating making them look elegant and festive. The cookies' multiple names reflected their widespread popularity. Different regions and ethnic groups claimed them as their own, creating the same cookie with different origin stories. The cookies taught an important baking lesson that butter quality mattered more than technique. Made with good butter, the cookies were sublime. Made with margarine, they were disappointing. This ingredient quality lesson separated grandmothers who understood that some shortcuts weren't worth taking. Yule log cake brought French sophistication to American Christmas tables through its rolled sponge cake designed to resemble a wooden log. This ambitious project cost about $1.25 and produced a show-stopping centerpiece that announced the baker possessed advanced skills. Grandmothers made Yule log by baking thin sponge cake in a jelly roll pan, spreading it with filling while still warm, then rolling it tightly and covering the roll with chocolate buttercream bark. The rolling had to happen while the cake was still warm and pliable. Cooled cake cracked when rolled, ruining hours of work. The buttercream was textured with a fork to resemble tree bark, and the log was decorated with meringue mushrooms, sugared cranberries, and sprigs of fresh holly. These decorations transformed simple rolled cake into elaborate sculpture that looked too beautiful to eat. The cake required planning because components had to be made in sequence. Sponge cake, baked and rolled, buttercream prepared and cooled to spreading consistency, meringue mushrooms baked and dried, decorations gathered. This multi-step process meant Yule log couldn't be made in a single afternoon. Yule log represented the peak of 1960s home baking ambition, French technique, elaborate decoration, impressive presentation. Making a successful Yule log announced that you'd mastered advanced baking skills and were willing to invest the time required for truly special desserts. The cake appeared primarily in households where the grandmother had European heritage or had traveled to Europe, bringing back culinary sophistication that marked her as worldly and cultured. Serving Yule log announced that your family valued international traditions and had the skills to execute them. Rehook 15, desserts down, halfway through Christmas baking, Lady Baltimore requiring 7-minute timing, cherry winks using cornflakes, hard sauce beaten by hand, tea cakes rolled twice in sugar, Yule logs demanding warm cake rolling. Grandmothers were engineers understanding that sequence, timing, and precision created desserts worthy of Christmas celebration. Spritz cookies. Spritz cookies required the cookie press, a specialized tool that separated serious bakers from casual ones, creating buttery cookies in decorative shapes that announced Scandinavian heritage. This equipment-dependent cookie cost about 50 cents per batch and produced 8 dozen cookies in shapes like Christmas trees, wreaths, and stars. Grandmothers made spritz cookies by creaming butter and sugar until fluffy, then adding eggs, vanilla, and almond extract before mixing in flour to create stiff dough. The dough was loaded into a cookie press, a tube with a plunger and interchangeable decorative plates, then pressed directly onto baking sheets in various shapes. The cookie press required technique. The dough had to be the right consistency. Too soft and shapes wouldn't hold, too stiff, and the press was impossible to operate. The baking sheet had to be ungreased. Grease prevented cookies from sticking long enough to release from the press, and the pressing motion had to be smooth and consistent. Grandmothers who mastered the cookie press could produce perfectly uniform cookies in elaborate shapes, while those who struggled created misshapen blobs that announced amateur status. This skill differential meant that cookie press proficiency became a mark of baking expertise. The cookies were decorated with colored sugar, silver dragées, or candied cherries before baking, creating jewel-like appearance that made them worthy of gift-giving. The decorations had to be applied immediately after pressing because the dough dried quickly and decorations wouldn't stick to dry surfaces. Spritz cookies represented investment in specialized equipment that had limited use. The cookie press came out only at Christmas, spending the rest of the year in storage. This single-purpose tool demonstrated commitment to tradition and willingness to own equipment that served only seasonal needs. Panoche fudge brought brown sugar sophistication to candy making through its caramel-like flavor that distinguished it from ordinary chocolate fudge. This temperamental candy cost about 60 cents and produced a pound of fudge that required precise temperature control and strong arms for beating. Grandmothers made panoche by boiling brown sugar, butter, and cream to exactly 238 degrees, the softball stage, then beating the hot mixture until it lost its gloss and began to thicken. The beating took 15 to 20 minutes of constant motion, creating arm fatigue that made candy making a physical challenge. The timing of when to stop beating separated successful fudge from grainy failure. Stop too soon and the fudge wouldn't set, creating soft, sticky candy. Beat too long and the fudge became grainy and crumbly rather than smooth and creamy. Grandmothers learned to recognize the exact moment when the mixture changed from glossy to matte, understanding that this visual cue meant it was time to pour immediately. Panouche was poured into buttered pans and cut into squares while still warm, but set enough to hold its shape. The squares were stored between layers of waxed paper in tins, creating gifts that announced the giver understood candy making and possessed the arm strength to execute it properly. The brown sugar flavor made panouche distinctive and sophisticated, appealing to adults who found chocolate fudge too sweet or childish. This adult appeal meant panouche appeared at grown-up gatherings rather than children's parties, marking it as refined rather than playful. Panouche's name sparked curiosity and required explanation. Most people had never heard the word and didn't know it came from Mexican Spanish. These naming discussions revealed that American Christmas baking drew from multiple cultural traditions, creating fusion desserts that combined techniques and flavors from various immigrant groups. Bourbon balls brought Kentucky tradition nationwide through their no-bake simplicity and adults-only bourbon content. This easy candy cost about 70 cents and produced 4 dozen balls that improved with age as the bourbon flavor mellowed and integrated. Grandmothers made bourbon balls by crushing vanilla wafers into fine crumbs, mixing them with powdered sugar, cocoa, chopped pecans, and corn syrup, then adding enough bourbon to make the mixture hold together when rolled into balls. The balls were rolled in additional powdered sugar and stored in tins for at least a week before serving. The aging process was essential. Fresh bourbon balls tasted harsh and alcoholic, but aged bourbon balls developed mellow, sophisticated flavor as the bourbon absorbed into the cookie crumbs and the flavors married. This aging requirement meant bourbon balls had to be made well before Christmas, teaching planning skills and delayed gratification. The bourbon content made them controversial in some households where alcohol was forbidden. Grandmothers who made bourbon balls often faced criticism from temperance-minded family members who argued that serving alcohol-infused candy normalized drinking. These debates revealed denominational and regional differences about alcohol acceptability. Some grandmothers made rum balls instead of bourbon balls, creating similar candy with different flavor profile. Others made adult and child versions, bourbon balls for grown-ups, vanilla extract balls for children, demonstrating that the same basic recipe could be adapted for different audiences. Bourbon balls represented the easiest Christmas candy to make, requiring no cooking, no temperature monitoring, no beating. This accessibility meant that even inexperienced candy makers could produce impressive results, democratizing candy making and allowing more women to contribute to Christmas dessert traditions. Sand tarts brought delicate, buttery elegance to cookie plates through their thin, crisp texture and almond-topped presentation. This refined cookie cost about 50 cents per batch and produced 6 dozen cookies so delicate they required careful handling to prevent breakage. Grandmothers made sand tarts by creaming butter and sugar until fluffy, then adding egg yolks, saving the whites for topping, and flour to create tender dough. The dough was chilled, rolled very thin, almost translucent, and cut into shapes. Before baking, each cookie was brushed with beaten egg white and topped with a blanched almond half and a sprinkle of cinnamon sugar. The thin rolling required skill. Too thick, and the cookies weren't properly delicate. Too thin, and they burned before fully baking. Grandmothers developed feel for proper thickness, understanding that the dough should be thin enough to see light through, but thick enough to handle without tearing. The cookies baked quickly and required constant watching because their thinness meant they could go from perfectly golden to burned in seconds. Grandmothers learned to trust their instincts about doneness, pulling cookies when they were just beginning to color at the edges. Sand tarts represented old-fashioned elegance that connected 1960s grandmothers to Victorian-era baking traditions. The cookies' delicate nature made them inappropriate for mailing or casual handling, meaning they appeared only at formal gatherings where guests understood they required gentle treatment. The name sand tarts referred to their sandy, crumbly texture created by the high butter-to-flour ratio. This texture made them melt on the tongue, creating luxurious mouthfeel that announced quality ingredients and proper technique. Ambrosia salad blurred the line between salad and dessert through its combination of fruit, coconut, and marshmallows bound together with sour cream or whipped cream. This Southern tradition cost about 90 cents and produced a large bowl that served 12 people with salad that tasted decidedly like dessert. Grandmothers made ambrosia by combining mandarin orange segments, pineapple chunks, maraschino cherries, miniature marshmallows, and sweetened coconut, then folding in sour cream or whipped cream to bind everything together. The mixture was refrigerated overnight to allow flavors to meld and marshmallows to soften slightly. The overnight rest was essential. Fresh ambrosia tasted like separate ingredients mixed together, but aged ambrosia transformed into cohesive dessert where flavors had married and textures had softened. This aging requirement meant ambrosia had to be made the day before serving, requiring planning that separated organized hostesses from last-minute ones. The classification of ambrosia sparked debates. Was it salad because it contained fruit, or dessert because it was sweet? These definitional discussions revealed regional differences, with Southern families firmly calling it salad, while Northern families considered it dessert. The debate mattered because it determined when ambrosia appeared in the meal sequence. Ambrosia represented 1960s embrace of convenience ingredients, canned fruit, jarred cherries, bagged coconut, and manufactured marshmallows. This reliance on processed ingredients marked a shift from earlier generations who would have used fresh fruit and homemade components. The dessert's name, ambrosia, meaning food of the gods, announced that despite humble ingredients, this combination created something divine. The mythological reference elevated simple fruit salad into special occasion fare worthy of Christmas dinner. Re-hook 20 desserts down, 2/3 complete. Spritz requiring specialized press. Panouche demanding 15 minutes of beating. Bourbon balls aging for weeks. Sand tarts rolled translucent thin, ambrosia transforming overnight. Grandmothers were specialists understanding that tools, timing, and technique created desserts that announced expertise through execution. 10 more desserts reveal the peak of Christmas baking mastery. This is the dessert that connected American grandmothers to centuries of British Christmas tradition, requiring equipment and techniques that most modern kitchens have abandoned entirely. Steamed plum pudding represented the ultimate make-ahead Christmas dessert, prepared in November, aged for weeks, and steamed again on Christmas Day before being served flaming with brandy. This elaborate tradition cost about $2 and produced a dark, dense pudding that served 12 people with dessert that tasted like concentrated Christmas spices and dried fruit bound together with suet and breadcrumbs. Grandmothers made plum pudding by mixing breadcrumbs, suet, beef fat, brown sugar, dried fruits, raisins, currants, candied citrus peel, nuts, eggs, and an elaborate spice blend including cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice. The mixture was packed into a pudding mold, a specialized container with a tight-fitting lid, then steamed for 6 to 8 hours in a large pot of simmering water that had to be monitored constantly to prevent boiling dry. The steaming process required equipment that most modern kitchens lack: a pudding mold with secure lid, a pot large enough to hold the mold with water reaching halfway up its sides, and a trivet or rack to keep the mold from sitting directly on the pot bottom. Grandmothers who made plum pudding owned this specialized equipment and understood the techniques required to use it successfully. After the initial steaming, the pudding was cooled, wrapped in cheesecloth, soaked in brandy, and stored in a cool, dark place for 4 to 6 weeks. Every week, the cheesecloth was refreshed with more brandy, creating a boozy preservation that prevented spoilage while adding flavor. This weekly maintenance required remembering to tend the pudding, demonstrating the kind of long-term commitment that characterized serious holiday baking. On Christmas Day, the pudding was steamed again for 2 hours to reheat it thoroughly. The reheating couldn't be rushed. Microwave reheating would ruin the texture, and oven heating would dry it out. Only gentle steaming preserved the pudding's moist, dense texture. The serving ritual was as important as the pudding itself. The pudding was unmolded onto a serving plate topped with a sprig of holly and doused with warmed brandy that was then ignited, creating blue flames that danced across the pudding's surface. The flaming pudding was carried into the darkened dining room, creating dramatic presentation that made children gasp and adults applaud. The pudding was served with hard sauce, butter and powdered sugar, beaten until fluffy, flavored with brandy, that melted on contact with the hot pudding, creating rich sauce that soaked into the dense crumb. Some families also offered custard sauce or whipped cream, giving guests choices about how to dress their pudding. Plum pudding represented everything that would disappear from American Christmas baking: British tradition maintained despite American identity, specialized equipment used once yearly, weeks of advance preparation, alcohol as both preservative and flavor, dramatic presentation involving fire, and dessert so dense and rich that small servings satisfied completely. The pudding's name confused Americans because it contained no plums. The name came from an archaic use of plum, meaning any dried fruit. These naming confusions sparked discussions about language evolution and how words changed meaning over time, creating educational moments around the Christmas table. Many families maintained plum pudding tradition because grandmothers or great-grandmothers had immigrated from Britain and brought the recipe with them. Making plum pudding connected families to their immigrant heritage and demonstrated that ethnic traditions deserved preservation even as families assimilated into American culture. By the 1970s, plum pudding was already disappearing from most Christmas tables, replaced by simpler desserts that didn't require specialized equipment or weeks of preparation. The grandmothers who maintained the tradition through the 1960s were often the last in their families to make it, with their children and grandchildren finding the process too complicated and the result too unusual for modern tastes. Charlotte Russe represented French elegance adapted for American home kitchens, creating a dessert so impressive it seemed to belong in restaurants rather than family dining rooms. This elaborate molded dessert cost about $1.50 and produced a stunning creation that served 8 to 10 people with Bavarian cream surrounded by lady finger cookies and topped with whipped cream rosettes. The dessert required specialized mold, precise timing with gelatin, and decorating skills that separated accomplished bakers from casual ones. Grandmothers made Charlotte Russe by lining a Charlotte mold, a round, straight-sided mold, with lady finger cookies standing upright, their flat sides facing inward. The cookies had to be trimmed to exact height and fitted tightly together to prevent the filling from leaking. This cookie arrangement required patience and precision, with each cookie positioned carefully and held in place until the filling was added. The filling was Bavarian cream, custard lightened with whipped cream and stabilized with gelatin. Making Bavarian cream required multiple steps: cooking custard on the stovetop without curdling it, dissolving gelatin in the hot custard, cooling the mixture to room temperature, then folding in whipped cream at the exact moment when the gelatin was beginning to set but hadn't yet become too firm to fold smoothly. The timing of when to fold in the whipped cream separated successful Charlotte Russe from failed attempts. Too early and the gelatin hadn't set enough, causing the whipped cream to deflate. Too late and the gelatin had set too much, creating lumps that couldn't be smoothed out. Grandmothers learned to recognize the exact consistency: thick enough to mound slightly when dropped from a spoon, but still liquid enough to pour. That signaled perfect folding time. The filled mold was refrigerated for at least 4 hours, preferably overnight, to allow the Bavarian cream to set completely. The unmolding required courage. The entire dessert could collapse if not properly set, or if the mold wasn't correctly prepared. Grandmothers ran a thin knife around the edge, dipped the mold briefly in warm water, then inverted it onto a serving plate with prayers that the charlotte would release intact. The unmolded charlotte revealed a cylinder of cream surrounded by a fence of lady fingers, creating architectural dessert that looked almost too beautiful to eat. The top was decorated with whipped cream rosettes piped through a pastry bag, candied violets or cherries, and sometimes chocolate shavings, transforming simple ingredients into elegant presentation. Charlotte Russe appeared at the most formal Christmas dinners, where the dessert's elegance matched the occasion's importance. Serving Charlotte Russe announced that the hostess possessed advanced skills, owned specialized equipment, and was willing to invest the time required for truly impressive desserts. The dessert's French name and sophisticated appearance made it seem exotic and worldly, appealing to families who valued European culinary traditions and wanted to demonstrate cultural sophistication. Making Charlotte Russe announced that your family appreciated fine dining and had the skills to recreate restaurant-quality desserts at home. The lady finger cookies could be homemade or purchased, with homemade announcing greater commitment to excellence, but purchased being more practical for busy grandmothers managing multiple Christmas preparations. This homemade versus purchased decision revealed each grandmother's priorities and time constraints. Charlotte Russe taught important lessons about gelatin behavior: how it set, how temperature affected it, how to work with it at different stages of setting. These lessons transferred to other gelatin-based desserts, creating foundational knowledge that elevated all cold desserts. By the 1970s, Charlotte Russe was already rare, appearing only in households where grandmothers had learned the technique from their mothers or grandmothers and were determined to preserve the tradition despite its complexity. The specialized charlotte mold became increasingly difficult to find, with many grandmothers improvising with spring-form pans or soufflé dishes that approximated the traditional shape. This is the dessert the hook promised would show you what baking mastery meant: a frozen ice cream dessert covered in meringue and baked just long enough to brown the meringue without melting the ice cream. Baked Alaska represented the peak of 1960s dessert showmanship, combining ice cream, cake, and meringue in a creation that seemed to defy physics by putting frozen dessert in a hot oven. This impressive feat cost about $2 and produced a dessert serving 8 to 10 people that generated gasps of amazement when brought to the table with its golden brown meringue peaks still warm from the oven while the interior remained frozen. Grandmothers made baked Alaska by starting with a base layer of sponge cake cut to fit a serving platter. Ice cream, usually a combination of flavors arranged in layers or blocks, was molded into a dome shape on top of the cake. Then the entire construction was frozen solid. This freezing had to be thorough. Any softness in the ice cream meant it would melt when the dessert was baked. The meringue was made by beating egg whites with cream of tartar until foamy, then gradually adding sugar while continuing to beat until the meringue formed stiff. Glossy peaks that held their shape when the beater was lifted. The meringue had to be beaten to exactly the right consistency. Underbeaten meringue would weep and slide off the dessert. Overbeaten meringue would be grainy and separate. The meringue was spread over the frozen ice cream and cake, completely covering every surface with no gaps or thin spots. This complete coverage was essential because the meringue acted as insulation, protecting the ice cream from the oven's heat. Any exposed ice cream would melt immediately, ruining the dessert. The assembled baked Alaska went into a very hot oven, 450 to 500 degrees, for just 3 to 5 minutes, long enough to brown the meringue peaks, but not long enough to melt the ice cream. This brief baking required watching through the oven window and pulling the dessert the instant the meringue turned golden brown. The timing was so critical that grandmothers often practiced with the oven door open, stopwatch in hand, learning exactly how long their particular oven needed to brown meringue without melting ice cream. This practice demonstrated the kind of dedication required for showstopper desserts. The baked Alaska was served immediately, sliced at the table so guests could see the frozen interior surrounded by warm meringue. The contrast between hot and cold, soft and creamy, sweet meringue and rich ice cream created sensory experience that made the dessert memorable beyond just its impressive appearance. Some grandmothers flambéed their baked Alaska, pouring warmed brandy over it and igniting the alcohol, creating blue flames that added even more drama to an already impressive dessert. This flaming presentation required confidence and fire safety knowledge, with grandmothers understanding that the flames would burn out naturally as the alcohol consumed. Baked Alaska appeared only at the most special Christmas dinners because it required last-minute assembly and baking that meant the cook couldn't fully participate in dinner. The dessert demanded attention right up until serving time, making it impractical for casual gatherings, but perfect for occasions where impressive presentation justified the inconvenience. The dessert's name commemorated the 1867 Alaska Purchase, though the connection between the territory and the dessert was unclear. These naming stories revealed that many classic desserts had origin myths that might or might not be historically accurate, but that added interest and conversation value. Baked Alaska represented everything ambitious about 1960s home baking: scientific understanding of how ingredients behaved, precise timing, specialized techniques, dramatic presentation, and willingness to risk spectacular failure in pursuit of impressive success. The dessert separated confident bakers from cautious ones because the margin for error was so small that only experienced cooks attempted it. Toffee Crunch Squares brought candy-making simplicity to Christmas baking through their easy preparation that required no special equipment or advanced techniques, creating treats that tasted like expensive toffee candy but cost pennies to make. This accessible recipe cost about 70 cents and produced 4 dozen squares that combined buttery toffee base with chocolate topping and chopped nut garnish. The dessert democratized candy making by eliminating temperature monitoring and precise timing, allowing even inexperienced bakers to produce impressive results. Grandmothers made toffee crunch squares by melting butter with brown sugar in a saucepan, boiling the mixture for exactly 3 minutes while stirring constantly. then spreading it over a layer of graham crackers arranged in a jelly roll pan. The hot toffee mixture soaked into the graham crackers, creating a base that was part cookie, part candy. The 3-minute boiling time was critical. Less and the toffee didn't set properly, more and it became too hard and candy-like rather than maintaining slight chewiness. The constant stirring prevented scorching and ensured even cooking, requiring attention but not advanced technique. After baking for 10 minutes to set the toffee, chocolate chips were sprinkled over the hot surface where they melted from residual heat. The softened chocolate was spread smooth with a spatula, creating a glossy layer that covered the toffee completely. Chopped pecans or almonds were sprinkled over the soft chocolate, pressed gently to ensure they adhered. The pan was refrigerated until the chocolate set firm, then cut into squares while still cold. Cutting cold prevented the chocolate from cracking and created clean edges that announced careful technique. The squares were stored in tins with waxed paper between layers, creating gifts that looked professional despite simple preparation. Toffee Crunch squares represented 1960s innovation in home baking, taking candy-making techniques and simplifying them for home cooks who lacked candy thermometers and specialized equipment. The graham cracker base eliminated the need for precise temperature control, while the chocolate chip topping eliminated the need for tempering chocolate. The recipe spread through neighborhood cookie exchanges and church baking circles, with each grandmother adding slight variations: different nuts, milk chocolate instead of dark, adding a sprinkle of sea salt on top. These variations created family signatures that made each grandmother's version distinctive and recognizable. The squares were particularly popular for gift-giving because they traveled well, didn't require refrigeration for short periods, and looked impressive despite simple preparation. Grandmothers packaged them in decorative tins with ribbons, creating gifts that announced thoughtfulness and effort without requiring advanced baking skills. The recipe's accessibility meant that even grandmothers who struggled with complicated desserts could produce Toffee Crunch squares successfully, creating confidence and encouraging them to attempt more challenging recipes. This confidence-building aspect made the recipe valuable beyond just the treats it produced. Marzipan fruits. Marzipan fruits brought European confectionery tradition to American Christmas tables through their hand-sculpted almond paste creations painted to resemble tiny fruits. This labor-intensive candy cost about $1 and produced 3 dozen miniature fruits that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Grandmothers made marzipan by grinding blanched almonds into fine paste, then mixing with powdered sugar and egg white to create smooth, pliable dough that could be molded like clay. The grinding required either a hand-cranked nut grinder or a mortar and pestle, creating arm fatigue that announced marzipan was earned through physical labor. The marzipan was tinted with food coloring: red for apples and strawberries, yellow for bananas and lemons, orange for oranges and peaches, green for pears and limes. The coloring had to be kneaded thoroughly to distribute evenly, creating uniform color without streaks or spots. The sculpting required artistic skill and patience. Each fruit was formed by hand, with details like apple stems made from cloves, strawberry seeds created by pricking with a toothpick, and banana curves shaped by rolling between palms. The fruits had to be small, about the size of a marble, because larger marzipan pieces were too sweet to eat in one bite. After sculpting, the fruits were painted with additional food coloring diluted with water, creating shading and depth that made them look realistic. Apples received red blush on one side, bananas got brown spots, strawberries were painted with darker red at the tips. This painting required steady hands and artistic eye that separated beautiful marzipan from crude attempts. The finished fruits were arranged in decorative boxes or on serving plates, creating edible still life displays that guests admired before eating. The visual appeal was as important as the taste, with marzipan serving as both dessert and decoration. Marzipan fruits represented German and Scandinavian Christmas traditions transplanted to America through immigration. Families who made marzipan were announcing their European heritage and demonstrating that ethnic foodways deserved preservation even as families assimilated into American culture. The candy appeared primarily in households where grandmothers had learned the technique from their own mothers or grandmothers who'd immigrated from Europe. This direct knowledge transfer meant marzipan making was dying out as immigration generation passed away and their American-born descendants found the labor too intensive for the results.